In the brutal world of the mob, godfathers are the kings.
When it came to business or honor, he would have you killed.
Some operate behind the scenes, and some in the spotlight of American justice.
He created an image. People said it was like Al Capone again. It was a new figure. It was John Gotti onto the scene.
But the most visible bosses are also the easiest targets of the law.
Gotti approached this as, I'm the boss. You can't convict me.
John Gotti, definition of the Mafia godfather. In the late 80s, one of the best-known figures in the country. He thrived on the attention and on his image of beating the law. Gotti was boss of New York's Gambino crime family, the most powerful mob clan in the country. But the roots of the Gambino family come from a far less conspicuous man. By the time the world got a good look at Carlo Gambino, in March 1970, he was already an old man. Quiet, dignified, grandfatherly, a wry grin etched on his face. The gentle facade belied Gambino's true nature as one of the most brutal and successful godfathers of all time.
Carlo Gambino reminds us of a very famous line from Shakespeare's King Lear. The Prince of Darkness is a gentleman.
Carlo Gambino came to America during the immigration wave of the 1920s. He was met at the docks by cousins who were already members of New York's bustling underworld. They immediately got Carlo a job that would put him at odds with the law.
Carlo Gambino was, as they say, connected. And right away they put him to work first in the illegal liquor trade.
It was the age of prohibition and bootlegging, a racket courtesy of American justice. Mobsters making money hand over fist. It was a chance for young Carlo to prove his worth.
He was a brilliant crook. He was very good at all facets of the illegal liquor game, hijacking rivals' trucks, things like that. Before long, he was recognized as an up-and-coming young man in the New York underworld.
Prohibition ended in 1933. Erasing the most lucrative business the mob had ever known. But Gambino had the proverbial Midas touch. When World War II broke out, the government issued ration stamps for essential products like gasoline and meat. Another restricted market, and Gambino saw another racket. He stole huge volumes of stamps and bribed corrupt officials for more. He resold them on the black market at an enormous markup. The scam quietly made Carlo his first million. The law never touched him. After the war, Gambino became second in command to Albert Anastasia, boss of one of the 5 crime families of New York. Anastasia was brutality personified, the most feared mobster of his day. He ran what the press dubbed Murder Incorporated, the mob's own hit squad for hire. He was nicknamed the Mad Hatter and Lord High Executioner. Anastasia's brother, Tough Tony, was head of the Longshoremen's Union. Together they shook down the union and controlled much of the New York waterfront. To get your goods to market without a hitch, you were well advised to give the Anastasia brothers a piece of the action. While Carlo was a loyal underboss, there was no denying his ambition. In 1957, he was 55 years old. Anastasia, his boss, 54. It seemed unlikely Carlo would ever be the top man. So Gambino set up a hit on the Mad Hatter. At 10 a.m. on August 14th, 1957, Anastasia went for his regular shave and trim at the Park Sheraton Hotel. As a warm towel was placed over his face, 3 gunmen burst in and pumped 5 bullets into the boss. Carlo Gambino was now godfather of the crime family that would come to bear his name. He had an extraordinary mind for business and rapidly connived to build an economic dynasty that would far outlive him. While the Gambinos already controlled the docks, the Godfather realized that the future was in the air. In the 1960s, he grabbed control of the unions that handled cargo at JFK International Airport. Now the Gambino family had a stake in everything moving in and out of the nation's busiest port of entry. They could steal at will and smuggle drugs, especially heroin, right under the nose of U.S. Customs. And the Godfather kept a hefty payroll for cops who looked the other way. Since the 1950s, the Mafia had controlled New York's garment industry. Gambino made it his own, securing an iron grip on the unions that supplied labor and transportation for garments. At the time, 70% of all clothes made in America came out of Manhattan. The price of each item included a hidden tax to Carlo Gambino. The family gained interests in the construction industry. They ran securities frauds on Wall Street. Not to mention gambling and old-fashioned loan sharking, Carlo Gambino became the CEO of organized crime.
Crime really paid off for him, and it was all accomplished by an illiterate, uneducated Sicilian who never became an American citizen.
In 1966, the Justice Department issued a deportation order against Gambino. But through a series of appeals, it was never implemented. In New York and elsewhere, American justice was woefully behind the mob. In fact, the feds were still trying to figure out who made up the highly secretive Mafia.
So we were at the disadvantage, actually, in going after the high echelon organized crime figures like Carlo Gambino. They were very, very well insulated.
Without much pressure from the law, Gambino ran his family like an emperor who tolerated no dissidents. He was utterly ruthless.
Carlo Gambino, to rise to the head of that family, had an ability actually to organize and rule a bunch of tough men. And also, when it came to business or honor, he would have you killed.
He was a brutal man. They said at the meetings where it would be discussed whether a certain individual should be bumped off, a nickname for the individual would be mentioned at the table. And Carlo Gambino's response was a very slow nodding of the head. That's all. He wouldn't even say anything. And the guy would be gone the next day.
Mr. Gambino, do you have any statement to make to the press?
Gambino coveted anonymity. Strictly adhering to Mafia traditions of a secret society, he shunned the press. Few news photos of Gambino were ever taken.
I don't believe that the average New Yorker really knew who Carlo Gambino was. Carlo Gambino, on the surface, was a illegitimate businessman.
Indeed, Gambino confounded American justice by running many legitimate businesses, including trucking companies and hundreds of pizza parlors. In a Mafia world designed with the specific intent of making money, Gambino really was the boss of bosses, arguably the most powerful man in all of New York.
He could do things that the mayor couldn't do. He could close down the whole port of New York if he wanted to. No ship could move out. No ship could come in. That's a lot of power.
The police did make arrests, but only for individual crimes. They nabbed a Gambino associate named John Gotti in 1969 for hijacking a cargo truck from JFK. But they never attacked the Godfather or the family because they didn't have the legal tools to do it. In the early 1970s, Gambino was arrested on suspicion of masterminding an armed robbery. But each time he neared trial, his heart would conveniently give out. His doctors would attest to his weak condition. Gambino finally did die of a heart attack on October 15, 1976, at home in his own bed, a rarity for a Mafia boss. This battle between godfathers and the law was barely a contest. Gambino won, hands down.
We never made a successful prosecution against Gambino. Never made one. That's an indication of his importance. That's an indication of that he's successfully resisted law enforcement, continued to make money, continued to run the unions he had access to, and basically died out of jail. That's a success.
The death of Godfather Carlo Gambino left a void at the head of the crime family and set up a violent power struggle that in time would help American justice bring down the dynasty the patriarch had created. Gambino had left one last order: that his cousin and brother-in-law, Big Paul Castellano, become the new boss. Castellano was not Carlo's number 2 man or underboss. That title belonged to Aniello Neil Della Croce.
Neil Della Croce was Carlo Gambino's underboss for 20 years. By rights, he should have taken over the crime family.
A very vicious criminal and a very, very adept leader, and the one who knew the rackets better than anyone else. But Gambino decided the important thing was blood.
Paul Castellano had been a high-ranking member of the family. An astute businessman, he was a major player in the meat industry in New York, owning several legitimate companies. As a mobster, he handled the more complicated rackets, labor unions, and rigging construction bids. Now Big Paul faced the daunting job of running the biggest and most violent crime family in America.
Basically, what the boss has is a tiger by the tail. And is he able to ride it? Is he able to be rational and violent? It's a contradiction.
Castellano immediately moved to pacify Della Croce, handing him near exclusive control of almost half the family rackets, including gambling and loan sharking. Placating Della Croce may have prevented an intra-family war, but it created a major split in the Gambino power structure, a potential opening for American justice.
Castellano's wing was dubbed the white-collar wing because it was more sophisticated, was involved in labor racketeering, controlled the garment center. Neil Della Croce was the head of the blue-collar wing. John Gotti was a key player in Neil's blue-collar wing. You know, they were involved in the strong-arm rackets. They were the hijackers, the loan sharks, the guys who did the muscle work whenever it was needed.
Della Croce was, in fact, Gotti's mentor, and Gotti his top captain. The new godfather had the misfortune to follow a legend into the top spot, a role he wasn't cut out for.
He had the mentality of the inheritor, not the founder. And he wanted to be considered not a crook, but a wealthy gentleman businessman.
He was a smart businessman, but he forgot that the reason why he had that clout or that edge was because he had the mob behind him, basically frightening competitors away and making sure that the unions didn't give him trouble.
A large, well-dressed man, Castellano had a voracious appetite for reading, women, and food.
He frequented not mob hangouts, but respectable Manhattan restaurants like the Sparks Steakhouse, where gentlemen businessmen ate.
In an attempt to remain viewed as an honest businessman, Castellano retreated from the day-to-day operations of the crime family. He built a huge mansion on Staten Island that came to be known as the White House.
He had lost touch with the young Turks that were coming up in the mob. He still relied on the respect and honor of the old Sicilian way, where his word was law, and they just would respect him and wouldn't go after him.
Castellano's rival, Neil Della Croce, was also from the old school, respected the boss out of a sense of duty, but he was everything the boss was not.
Neil Della Croce, he was the Little Italy strong man. He spent most of his time in the Ravenite social club of Mulberry Street, and Manhattan was his bailiwick. He was the one that kept the tough guys in line. A very steely, blue-eyed, 6-foot thug that I can understand why he could keep a lot of mob guys in line. He had the personality and the physical appearance to do it.
While Castellano and Della Croce were splitting up turf, American justice was undergoing a transformation of its own.
Law enforcement evolved for the positive in from the 70s up to the 90s. We started to get some teeth into our bite.
In 1979, FBI agent Jim Kostler created separate task forces for each of the 5 New York crime families, including the Gambinos. At the time, American justice was learning to make use of new laws that let them wiretap the mob and attack it as an organization.
the hierarchy is going to introduce you or lead you to all the other members. And if you could take out the hierarchy or prosecute the hierarchy and put them in jail, the entire family would be in disarray.
But the Gambinos were creating plenty of disarray on their own, this time over drug trafficking. There was one strict rule laid down by Paul Castellano and most other New York godfathers: no drug dealing, under penalty of death. An edict dating back to the 50s. Drug trafficking meant heat from the law. Only now there was so much money in drugs that most mobsters bent the rule with a nudge and a wink.
The rule really, according to most people, is not don't get involved in drugs, it's just don't get caught dealing drugs.
Even though mob figures know that their soldiers are involved in narcotic dealing, they will never mention it. And if their soldiers mention it in front of them, they would get a slap right across the face. You never put a boss in a position where he can be implicated in a conspiracy, and especially when it got to do with narcotics.
It was exactly that double standard and the stepped-up efforts of American justice that would cause the supreme upheaval in the Gambino family. In 1983, using information obtained from a bug, police arrested 8 Gambino soldiers for heroin smuggling, including Angelo Ruggiero and Gene Gotti. Both worked for Gene's brother, John. Castellano was furious. He demanded copies of the FBI tapes from Ruggiero. At Neil Delacroce's headquarters in Queens, another bug picked up this conversation, where Ruggiero explained to John Gotti and Delacroce that he would not give the tapes to the Godfather.
I'm going to tell you something. If you two never bother with me again in the rest of my life, I ain't giving them tapes. I can't. There's good friends of mine on them tapes. Well, he's the boss. You have to do what he tells you.
That's why I said to you before, you don't understand what the Nostra means that the boss is your boss. Understand?
But Ruggiero would not give up the tapes.
Now what do you want me to tell her? The guy says, F*** you, we don't want to give you the fuck.
No, I don't want I told you, stay out of it. I told Johnny, please.
Delacroce, not wanting a war with Castellano, stalled for time. All along, American justice sat, listened, and waited. Castellano was in a tough spot. He was now being closely watched to see how he disciplined his own family. Vincent the Chin Gigante of the Genovese family told Big Paul that according to the drug rule, Ruggiero had to be killed.
Castellano has a problem. He's getting pressure from another boss to enforce the rule in his own family. At the same time, he's got a problem within the family. What should he do about this?
But before Castellano could resolve the conflict, he had to worry about his own criminal defense. Federal agents arrested Castellano in March 1984 for being the head of an auto theft ring. Prosecutors said although Castellano had nothing to do with the thefts themselves, as head of the crime family, he had profited. Then the roof caved in. Another indictment, this one built on hundreds of tapes from yet another bug. They recorded Castellano conducting mob business in his White House, the one place Big Paul thought he was secure. These charges ranged from murder to prostitution. But perhaps more importantly, the tapes caught Castellano bad-mouthing every other crime boss in New York. The bug had actually been in place for months before the arrest. Castellano had discussed many individual crimes, but the FBI had waited to haul in the boss.
Therein lies the difference between attacking an individual as a criminal and a group. When you set out to attack the group, you're looking for the crimes of the group, not just that individual person.
Castellano was charged as head of the crime family. The Godfather was in serious trouble. Not only had he bad-mouthed bosses, but there was talk among mobsters that Big Paul might rat to save his own skin, and he had yet to deal with his own family in the Ruggiero drug case. John Gotti wanted Castellano hit, but Delacroce would not allow it. On December 2nd, 1985, Neil Delacroce died of brain cancer at the age of 71. Gotti was now the top man in the blue-collar faction of the family. Within a week, two critical events. Castellano missed Della Croce's funeral, a sign of Mafia disrespect that deeply angered Gotti. And then, the Godfather announced to the family that he was breaking up Gotti's drug-running crew and reassigning them. He called Gotti to dinner at Sparks Steakhouse to discuss his future.
Gotti felt that this was basically a front, and that he himself was going to be marked for death by Paul Castellano. In part because of the tapes, but in part because he was afraid also that John Gotti was a power and might want to move to the top himself.
With Gotti feeling he must kill or be killed, Castellano arrived at the steakhouse for their summit at about 5 p.m. on December 16, 1985. That very evening, mob expert Robert Blakey, who helped write some of the new anti-racketeering laws, happened to be lecturing a group of New York FBI agents on how to use them.
And suddenly, every one of their buzzers, their beepers suddenly went off. And they all went in the corner and make some phone calls, and they'll let it come back and say, we can't stay for the lecture. Castellano just got killed.
I think we're witnessing at least part of the changing of the guard. I think we're witnessing a convolution within La Cosa Nostra that hasn't been seen since its beginnings.
Godfathers, if they weren't being knocked off, were being indicted. The biggest trial involved the heads of 3 of New York's 5 families, the Commission case. Tony Dux Carollo of the Lucchese family, Carmine Persico of the Colombos, and Fat Tony Salerno, who ran the Genovese family. Paul Castellano had been indicted as well before he was hit, all charged in February 1985 with being members of the Mafia Commission. The Commission was the Supreme Court of the New York mob. Crime bosses met to settle disputes and divide up territory. To indict the Commission as a criminal organization was unprecedented for American justice.
The Commission case, I think, was the major case in the history of organized crime investigation and prosecution in the United States. It established the existence of the mob, the existence of the Commission, the existence of families, and the identity of those who controlled Cosa Nostra, at least in the New York metropolitan area.
The indictment charged the Commission with construction bid rigging, assuring that the crime families controlled which contractors got lucrative building jobs. Mob bosses would then skim huge profits off the top. A unique case in that it involved very few witnesses. The primary evidence was from tapes made from bugs in Carollo's Jaguar, in Salerno's social club, and in Castellano's mansion.
When you played the tapes, the 5 families were exposed, the Commission was exposed. You didn't need a witness. It was a very, very difficult case for the defendants.
In fact, unwinnable. In January 1986, the heads of the 3 families were each sentenced to 100 years in prison. A defining moment in the war between godfathers and the law. And within the mob itself. With Castellano dead and the others behind bars, there was a changing of the guard. New leaders with a new set of values.
Their predecessors understood that the important thing was the strength and the success of the organization. The new generation sees this as something different. They are the me generation, the yuppie generation. They're the ones that are interested in themselves above the organization.
A trend that made the yuppie mobsters especially vulnerable to American justice. For the Gambinos, it was the beginning of the age of Gotti.
You know, I always felt good.
He was made for the news media because he reminded them of Al Capone, of the Al Capone days that they read about.
They talked about him being like other people, but the truth of the matter is he was his own person, really. He was a new figure, and it was John Gotti onto the scene.
Hey, tell me about it.
In some psychology courses, they talk about the dominant male. I think he was it in capital letters, and underscored.
John Gotti grew up in Queens and early on became a Gambino soldier. After 2 years in prison for hijacking a JFK cargo truck, he was back doing muscle work for underboss Neil Della Croce. Gotti quickly gained a reputation as a tough guy. In 1973, a family rival kidnapped and killed the nephew of the aging godfather, Carlo Gambino. Gambino swore immediate revenge. John Gotti got the contract to kill the killer. Gotti made the hit, but it was sloppy. There were witnesses. He was arrested. The family hired renowned defense attorney Roy Cohn to defend their man. Cohn bargained the murder rap down to 2 years. By 1979, American justice had its eye on Gotti. He was the top capo, or captain, for Neil Della Croce, directing a crew of wise guys.
They used to call him the handsome guy because he was a fastidious dresser and very hygienic and kept himself well groomed.
Gotti's ego, ambition, and blatant disregard for the old mob rules, including drug running, would lead him to murder godfather Paul Castellano in December 1985.
John Gotti had the courage or the balls or whatever to go after the boss and try to kill him.
He did it and seized control of the family. But the dynasty begun by Carlo Gambino was crumbling.
Gambino was a sophisticated individual who had interest in a variety of ventures. He's succeeded by Castellano, and Castellano has a basic problem. He has a divided family. When Gotti steps up and kills Castellano, that's an indication that the white-collar crime, union corruption faction, which is the future, loses out to the past and Gotti.
The law wasted no time in challenging John Gotti. In March 1986, just 3 months after Castellano was gunned down, Gotti was hauled in on charges he had punched and robbed this man, Romuald Pajcik, in a traffic dispute a year and a half earlier. But when news reports kept showing Gotti's picture as the likely successor to Castellano, Pajcik developed a sudden case of amnesia on the stand. Couldn't remember who punched him. Case dismissed. A minor distraction for Gotti, but an opportunity for the press to become smitten with the new godfather. His $1,000 suits and coiffed hair. They dubbed him the Dapper Don. The new godfather was back in court 1 month later for racketeering. But the prosecution had a big problem. Their best witnesses against Gotti were convicted killers and drug dealers who were getting shorter sentences in exchange for their testimony. Gotti's attorney, Bruce Cutler, dissected them as liars. Gotti himself appeared supremely confident of his acquittal, which, after a 6-month trial, he got.
My God, to see him in a courtroom as a defendant was a sight to behold, especially the earlier trials. He looked like he owned the courtroom.
In fact, he did, at least one critical part.
$60,000 was paid to one of the jurors to throw the case and to convince the other jurors to vote not guilty. In fact, that juror is now in jail, having been convicted of taking a bribe. So the first 2 acquittals were not exactly due to the skill at defending a lawsuit. They were corruption of the process.
But to the press, Gotti seemed charmed. The Teflon Don, they now called him, Mr. Untouchable. Meanwhile, the New York mob was still battling to figure out who controlled what after the 1985 commission trial. In January 1989, Gotti was indicted again, this time for ordering the shooting of construction union agent John O'Connor. In 1985, O'Connor sent union thugs into this New York restaurant to destroy work done by non-union labor. Unfortunately, the building belonged to the Gambinos. 3 months later, O'Connor was shot 4 times in the buttocks.
John O'Connor was shot because John Gotti ordered it to teach him a lesson.
To prove their case, the prosecution played tapes of Gotti repeating O'Connor's address over the phone. And then a garbled sentence the prosecution said was, "Bust him up." it apparently was not clear to the jury.
How say you with respect to defendant John Gotti, guilty or not guilty?
We find him not guilty.
Legally or otherwise, the Godfather had now beaten the rap 3 times.
I think he began to believe his own press clippings and believed he was infallible and untouchable.
But the law would keep coming. 3 times American justice had tried to get John Gotti and failed. The Godfather was gaining a nationwide reputation as untouchable, his popularity soaring in the role of the underdog. But in 1991, the U.S. Attorney's Office decided to go after the Don once more on a huge racketeering case, alleging that as the head of the Gambinos, he had overseen 5 murders, including that of Paul Castellano.
And we were also able to charge loan sharking businesses, gambling businesses in Queens, in Connecticut, various acts of obstructing justice. We were able to charge them all in one indictment because they were all committed by John Gotti as part of his leadership of the crime family.
The Don was cocky. He seemed to view the trial as a game between himself and the law.
He basically raised the stakes of the trial because it became very much a, can the government convict John Gotti?
But the government sent an early sign that this trial would not be like the rest. It moved to bar Gotti's longtime attorney, Bruce Cutler, alleging that surveillance tapes showed him to be too close to organized crime. On this bug, Gotti is complaining about Cutler's fees.
Where's it? Gambino played him. This is Chagall, Cutler and Leopold played him. You know and I know that they know that you're taking the money to the table. Every time you take a client on one of a sudden you're breaking the law.
The judge agreed, and Cutler was barred from the trial.
I am just personally offended and angry, and I still cannot fathom that I will not be addressing this jury in this case.
While Cutler was later cleared of any wrongdoing, Gotti was forced to get another lawyer, Albert Krieger. The prosecution then asked for and received a sequestered and anonymous jury. No names would be released, only juror numbers. An unusual request, but one the prosecution argued was necessary, given Gotti's history of intimidating jurors and witnesses. Security around the courthouse was also heavy. All these measures, argued Albert Krieger, sent the jury a message.
That is physical evidence without benefit of confrontation. That evidence tells the jury that we, the United States, have more than passing reason to feel that that person being tried is a threat now to you.
The heart of the government's case came from a bug in a small apartment over the Ravenite Social Club, Gotti's headquarters. There, Gotti, his underboss, Frankie Locascio, and consigliere Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano had met, often for nothing more than socializing.
One popular misconception about organized crime, about gangsters, is that their day-to-day conversation is really exciting and interesting. It's not. I mean, they talk about horses and the Yankees and their girlfriends and the pasta. They know enough not to talk about criminal activity in the club itself because they know over the years we bug clubs.
To discuss business, Gotti and his partners would go outside and walk around the block where they knew they could not be taped. But 5 times in the winter of 1989, Gotti had slipped and talked about family matters inside. 5 damaging conversations. John Gleason was the lead prosecutor. His strategy? First prove the existence of the crime family and that Gotti ran it. He went right to the tapes. Gotti had spelled it out, even using the Mafia reference to itself. Cosa Nostra, literally, our thing.
This is going to be a Cosa Nostra when I die. It'll be an hour from now, it'll be tonight, or 100 years from now when I'm in jail. It's going to be a Cosa Nostra. It's going to be the way I say it's going to be, it'll be a Cosa Nostra. A Cosa Nostra.
Next step, prove that Gotti ordered the crimes he was charged with, including the murder of mafioso Louis De Bono. He talked about turf, When someone made the mistake of opening an unauthorized gambling operation, Gotti sent this brutal warning.
You come this punk out of me, John Gotti, you'll sever your mother head off, you sucker.
Even Gotti's lawyer Krieger calls the tapes a smoking gun.
It's like pretending that Mount Everest is not before you when you stand in Nepal. It's there.
The bugs also provided an insight into Gotti's management style. On one tape, he makes preparations for his consigliere, Sam Gravano, to become acting boss if he himself were sent to jail.
So I'm asking you, how you feel? You want to sing us through the year? Or you want me to make you official underboss, acting boss? How do you feel? What makes you feel better?
You hear the real John Gotti on the tapes that we made. He was a brutal, murderous boss, but he was also capable of great charm in dealing with people. He wasn't boss of that family for nothing. He knew how to deal with people and manage people.
Gotti had been indicted on the tapes alone, but 10 weeks before trial, the government acquired an equally damaging weapon. Gotti's co-defendant in the indictment, Sam Gravano, wanted to make a deal. Facing life in prison if convicted with Gotti, Sammy the Bull would talk for a reduced sentence and entry into the Witness Protection Program. When Gotti first heard Gravano would turn, he was devastated.
That was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and as soon as he could get to a phone, he was calling around. He called his brother Pete in Queens, and he called others to let them know what he had heard and to check it out and make sure it had happened. He knew he was dead meat if it were true.
It was. In his 1992 racketeering and murder trial, John Gotti was already reeling from incriminating bugged conversations. But the Godfather took another blow when his right-hand man and confidant, Sammy the Bull Gravano, decided to save himself from life in prison and testify against the boss. Gravano was the biggest mob figure to turn for the government since Joe Valachi first blew the lid off the Mafia's secrecy in 1963. A betrayal punishable by death.
What I'm telling you, what I'm exposing to you and the press and everybody, this is my doom.
It was not Valachi's doom. He died of natural causes in prison. But Gravano had the safety hatch of the government's Witness Protection Program, guaranteeing him a new identity, perhaps even plastic surgery, when he was released from prison. It is one of the most vital tools in fighting the mob.
Forget Sammy Gravano. Nobody anywhere near organized crime is going to walk in and, as a matter of civic duty, volunteer to testify against John Gotti. It's very important to be able to assure somebody that if they make that decision, if they choose to cooperate, we will protect them and their families.
But as Gravano arrived to testify, many were questioning the wisdom of the prosecution in making a so-called deal with the devil. Gravano had confessed to planning or executing 19 murders. The jury might find him unsympathetic and unbelievable. But Gravano had corroboration. He had the taped conversations of Gotti. Defense attorney Albert Krieger prodded the government star witness to admit he had molded his testimony to fit what was on the tapes. Gravano held firm that he had no reason to lie, but the idea was planted in the jury's mind. In fact, Gravano's most damaging testimony was about something Gotti denied on the tapes: responsibility for the 1985 murder of Godfather Big Paul Castellano. Gravano testified that not only had Gotti ordered the hit, but that he and Gotti had been in a car just down the street when the murder took place. Gravano said it was a rule to deny involvement in any conversation about the boss's murder.
But they did kill Paul. They were there. And Gravano's testimony is what proved that part of our case. His testimony was overwhelmingly compelling. Once Gravano finished his testimony, we rushed to rest our case.
The jury took less than a day to reach its verdict.
The first word out of the foreperson's mouth was whether we had proved the Castellano murder. And she stood up and very confidently said, proven, and then said guilty with respect to all of our counts. And none of us who were involved in this will ever forget that.
He didn't win fair and square. He played a game that he didn't play fair and square. My father is the last of the Mohegans. They don't make men like him anymore, and they never will.
Gotti supporters staged a mini riot outside the courthouse. Most were from Gotti's Queens neighborhood. While a huge victory for the law, the conviction was also seen as evidence of how the Gambinos disintegrated from within.
As soon as Gotti decided to hit Castellano, he signed a death certificate for the family. Everything else was detail. When Gotti says, "I'm in it for myself, I can kill Castellano," Gravano says, "I'm in it for myself, I can testify against Gotti." What you have to do is hang together.
John Gotti received the mandatory life sentence without possibility of parole. He died of cancer in a prison hospital in 2002. Gravano was released in 1995, though he eventually went back to prison on drug charges. In 2002, the plea deal angered Krieger.
Gravano is filth to his core. What he has done is he has found a way to bargain for his freedom, and we buy it. And when we buy it, we get into the same sewer as he.
But prosecutors argue that Gravano's testimony was worth it, finally allowing them to get a man they had targeted for years. And for many, getting Gotti was more than just a job.
It was a matter of honor for me, because this is the guy that people were looking up to. The Italian-American kids in New York will start dressing like John Gotti, all acting like John Gotti. I'm Italian-American, and I believe that these people should be looking towards people like me to be respectful of, and not John Gotti. Lawman versus The Godfather. You know, I'm here speaking to you, but John Gotti is spending the rest of his life in jail.
American justice had beaten The Godfather, but the impact of convicting a single individual remains in question.
This is not the James gang, that once Jesse and Frank are killed, the James gang dissipates. These were put up into organized crime units with a commission, and you can see a continuity over time in the organization that transcends any one individual.
And yet, a single individual is still remembered for creating the organization.
Or quits.
1930, New York City, gripped in its bloodiest gangland war ever. The casualties littered the streets of Manhattan and Brooklyn. Eventually, one man would emerge from this chaos and bloodshed, Charles Lucky Luciano. His rise to power was a model for all the godfathers who came after him. It was also a model for American justice in its war with the godfathers. Born Salvatore Lucchini in 1897 in Sicily, he and his parents immigrated to New York in 1907. Within months, young Charlie was on the streets, stealing from stores and pushcarts. By age 14, he left home, quit school, and started running with the infamous 5 Points gang, the kind of finishing school for future mobsters, including Al Capone. Early on, Luciano passed his first test of gang loyalty. Busted on a drug charge, he refused to rat on his partners in crime. He had kept the gang's code of silence. As his rap sheet got longer, he held to that code, keeping the law at bay and fellow mobsters safe. Upon Lucky's release, the 5 Points gang made him a full member. He earned the nickname Lucky through his uncanny ability to evade arrest and his phenomenal skill, or luck, at gambling. By 1920, Luciano had joined another local gang, headed by the notorious Joe the Boss Masseria. Lucky muscled his way into the prostitution racket. It didn't take long for the madams and pimps of New York to learn that when Lucky's boys came by for their protection money, it was advisable to pay them. Others, not so smart, were intimidated, beaten, or killed. Lucky seemed to be just that. Until one night in October 1929, Luciano was on the docks inspecting a dope shipment when he was jumped by 4 men and thrown into the back of their car. Their leader, Legs Diamond, wanted to get rid of Lucky and take over the brothel business. For the next several hours, as the car cruised the streets of Brooklyn, Luciano was beaten, stabbed, and slashed, and finally dumped on a deserted street and left to die. But somehow, Lucky survived, and quickly exacted his revenge. Over the next year, members of the Legs Diamond gang began to disappear. Finally, on December 18th, 1931, Legs himself was gunned down. Luciano had now passed a second test on his way to becoming a godfather, the willingness to use violence to enforce his authority. By 1930, Lucky's boss, Joe Masseria, was locked in a violent struggle with Salvatore Maranzano for control of New York. Street warfare, drive-by shootings, a mob killing field. Police were helpless to stop it. It was a war that provided Luciano with a chance to demonstrate the supreme mark of a godfather, cunning. In a classic example of mob treachery, Luciano lured his boss to his favorite restaurant, Scarpato's, in Coney Island. After the meal, Lucky excused himself to wash his hands. Minutes later, 4 hitmen made sure it would be Masseria's last meal. Lucky now sent word to his boss's bitter foe, Maranzano, called for a meeting, and made peace with him. But Luciano was just biding his tongue. On September 10th, 1931, hitmen acting on orders from Luciano entered Maranzano's offices near Grand Central Station. They shot and stabbed him to death in his foyer. Charles Luciano had killed and connived his way to the top.
His word was law in the underworld. He was universally respected because he was so feared. He had killed off all his enemies without a qualm.
Now Luciano had the power to put his ideas into action and create a mob organization that would test the limits of American justice. Whether in gambling or the numbers racket, Luciano broke new ground because he was willing to do business with non-Italians. Men like Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, as long as they made him money, they were in.
What Luciano did for traditional Italian, Sicilian organized crime is Americanize it. They would have alliances with Jewish groups, with anybody that they could make money and exercise power with.
It was Luciano who established the Commission, the governing body of New York's underworld that would carve up territory and operate unchallenged for half a century.
Like Ford learned to make Model Ts, Luciano learned to organize prostitution and make money on it, to organize dope and make money on it, to organize the unions and make money on it, and to organize the families so that they wouldn't fight with each other.
Luciano kept the prostitution racket for himself. He now reigned supreme in an underworld of his making, an underworld American justice was yet to penetrate. That is, until 1935. New York Governor Herbert Lehman appointed a new special prosecutor, Thomas Dewey, who would pioneer a new way for the law to fight the Godfathers.
For 20 years, the underworld has preyed on our people and robbed them, and then frightened them into silence. But now, the day of fear of the gangster is coming to an end.
Serious and ambitious, Dewey, a former U.S. attorney, first set his sights on Dutch Schultz, the czar of gambling in Harlem and the Bronx. Dewey had nursed a hatred for Schultz since Election Day, 1928, when, as a young Republican poll watcher, he had witnessed the Schultz gang, working for the Democratic machine, intimidate voters. In his previous job, Dewey had tried and failed to put Schultz away for tax evasion. Schultz, isolated, erratic, and feeling the heat of the law, now decided to ignore generally accepted Mafia rules, which prohibited the killing of honest lawmen, and take out Dewey. When Luciano and the Commission learned of Schultz's plan, the Godfather arranged for the hitman to become the hit. Little did Dewey know that a mobster had spared his life. The prosecutor and his staff now began looking into prostitution and rumors that a single organization was running the brothels of New York. In a first for American justice, Dewey placed wiretaps in the whorehouses, identified the various hookers, and then, in a mass arrest, brought in more than 100 women. Hoping that under pressure of jail, some might begin to testify, Dewey set their bail at the maximum. Dewey's hunch proved right. Many of the prostitutes, abused and angry, did name names. one name that continued to surface: Charles Luciano. The law now went after the Godfather. Dewey argued that because Lucky had been running a prostitution shakedown ring, he was guilty as a racketeer. In order to prosecute the king of the pimps, Dewey had to first persuade the New York legislature to pass the nation's first anti-racketeering bill, a turning point in the war between godfathers and the law. Luciano's luck had run out. He was convicted of compulsory prostitution and sentenced to 30 to 50 years, a tour de force for Dewey.
First of all, he investigates the case using electronic surveillance. He brings in witnesses and immunizes them. Then he not only proves the individual crimes, he proves the cash flow. And he cross-examines Luciano with his taxes, or the absence of the cash flow. And then he's able to try Luciano not individually for a single offense, but for the group of the offenses, for being a racketeer, exactly what he was.
Following Lucky's conviction, Dewey soon retired from the war against the mob. He became governor of New York, then ran twice unsuccessfully for president. In the meantime, Dewey pardoned Luciano in 1945. The Godfather had spent World War II in jail, but supposedly provided intelligence to the military as the Allies were planning their invasion of fascist Italy. Yet the condition of Luciano's release was deportation to his native Sicily. Lucky died of a heart attack on January 26, 1962, at the airport in Naples, as he was about to meet with a Hollywood producer to discuss making a film about his illustrious career as a godfather. Las Vegas mob insider Ed Becker is among those who suspect that Lucky's old friends, fearful of what he might reveal, accelerated his demise.
I'm not a conspiracy buff, but he was about to do a movie. He was meeting somebody, a producer in the airport, to sell him his movie rights, and he died. He had one drink and walked across the floor and dropped dead. Well, you know, the Borgia drink, they call it. A little sip of arsenic, a little old lace, and away you go.
The most successful godfathers have been the ones who, unlike Charles Luciano, eluded American justice. The mobsters have a clear edge when the law is not crusading against them. That was the case during World War II. With America's focus overseas, the law, including FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, paid little attention to organized crime. Hoover even denied there was a mafia. That was fine by this man, Anthony Accardo. He was not looking to get his face in the newspaper as he quietly consolidated his power within the Chicago underworld.
When Accardo became the boss in 1944, he really walked into a situation where nobody was looking over his shoulder. There was no law enforcement agency that was doing anything really about organized crime.
Accardo's rise was similar to that of many godfathers of his generation. Born near the turn of the century, he grew up in the heart of Chicago's Little Italy. By the middle of the Roaring '20s, Accardo had become a chauffeur to the world's most famous mobster, Scarface Al Capone, a critical role, according to Mafia expert Edward Becker.
Accardo was a chauffeur. All the big guys started out as chauffeurs to the boss. And that's how they became the boss. They knew all the secrets, they knew all the places, and that was Accardo.
One secret which Accardo would take to his grave was the truth about his alleged role as one of the 5 hitmen who, on Valentine's Day, 1929, gunned down members of the rival Bugs Moran gang in a Chicago warehouse. A hit which sealed Capone's grip on the city's crime syndicate, known as the Outfit. Soon Accardo became one of Capone's enforcers, earning the nickname Joe Batters for his proficiency with a baseball bat.
The reason they called him Joe Batters was that he would batter his opponents into submission. He was a feared man, no question about it.
As with Luciano, Accardo traded on his reputation for brutality to claw his way to the top. When the law caught up with Capone in 1931, and he was jailed for tax evasion, Accardo won control over the outfit's gambling operations in Chicago and Florida. By the end of World War II, Tony Accardo was the undisputed boss. Unlike New York, where the Gambinos and other families competed for control, The Chicago outfit was ruled by one family and one godfather. Accardo's power was grounded in fear. Stories about his brutal nature became legendary, including one about a jewelry heist in 1978.
There had been a break-in, a burglary by outfit burglars at a jewelry store on the near north side. The owner of that jewelry store apparently was a friend of Accardo. He complained to Accardo that these guys had come in unauthorized and had stolen this loot, this swag. So the swag was taken to Accardo's home in River Forest and kept there in the basement, to be returned eventually, apparently, to the jeweler.
Then the burglars decided that they had been wronged, and so when Tony Accardo had left for Palm Springs in January, early January, they robbed his house.
When Accardo found out about it, one FBI source told me that his informant said the old man, he had never seen the old man so angry.
Their throats were slashed, their faces were burned off with acetylene torches, they were castrated, tortured in other words, before they were killed, and then all placed in trunks of their cars and found throughout the Chicago area. Nobody fooled around with Tony Accardo.
Now, that's incredible power. There's nobody in the city of Chicago today can say my house shall not be burglarized, and if burglarized by accident, the property shall be returned, and that there'll be a death penalty imposed for burglary. That's power.
Accardo, like Carlo Gambino, kept a low profile. But in the 1950s, Senate hearings woke the country to the existence of organized crime and its infiltration of American life. The first hearings, led by Tennessee Senator Estes Kefauver, were also the nation's first live TV event. The public watched in awe as gangsters like Frank Costello of New York testified.
You must have in your mind some things you've done that you can speak of to your credit as American citizens. If so, what are they?
Paid by tax.
Tony Accardo's appearance was marked notably by what he didn't say. He took the fifth 144 times. In 1956, Senator John McClellan of Arkansas called Accardo before his committee. The Godfather pulled the same trick.
I decline to answer. I decline to answer. I decline to answer.
They brought Tony Accardo before it because he was the man. And again, they didn't lay a glove on him.
Or more to the point, couldn't lay a glove on him. No one would rat.
Obviously, it was very difficult to, particularly in Accardo's heyday, to get anybody to testify against him. It was a one-way ticket to cement shoes, probably, if you did that.
Federal efforts were also lagging behind because FBI Director Hoover still stubbornly refused to acknowledge the mob's existence. But he would soon be forced to change his mind. November 14th, 1957, in the upstate New York town of Appalachian, police broke up a secret meeting in this house of over 100 mob leaders from across the country. The first hard proof of a national organization of crime. Tony Accardo was not at the Appalachian Summit. Months earlier, wanting to get out of the public spotlight, Accardo simply resigned. Leadership was quietly turned over to his hand-picked successor, Sam Giancana. Yet it was clear that the Big Tuna, as Accardo was known, was still calling the shots. A clever move. Mob busting was fast becoming a national priority. FBI Director Hoover was now compelled to launch his Top Hoodlum program, THP. Bill Romer was a charter member of the Chicago THP team.
We were novices. We knew nothing at all. It was like a primer. We were in the first grade, and we knew nothing at all about who these guys were.
In the 1950s, federal laws allowing bugs and phone taps were not yet on the books. So American justice suffered from an appalling lack of legal weapons for a war against the Godfathers. But Hoover cited national security as a pretext to eavesdrop on the mobsters anyway. The FBI boss gave Romer and his team their marching orders. Bug Accardo's downtown headquarters.
But he told us that if we got caught, we would be considered rogue agents and that we would be disowned and thrown to the wolves. And so most of the agents, to be very frank, most of the agents really didn't feel they wanted to go ahead under those circumstances.
On the second floor of this building, the agents cautiously planted their bug. They called it Little Al, after Al Capone.
I was the first guy in, and boy, I can tell you, we were very, very happy when we found that we could do this without getting shot, because they had every right to shoot us.
Little Al proved a gem.
They were talking about who they were going to kill, what police captains and politicians they had corrupted, what they were doing in Las Vegas, what the sources of their income was.
Prosecutors now took a chapter out of the Al Capone era and went after the big tuna for tax evasion. Despite his luxurious home, equipped with an indoor swimming pool, Accardo had for years claimed to be nothing more than a modest beer salesman. In 1960, Accardo was indicted. Again, Little Al would prove its worth in tipping off the agents that the Godfather was planning a standard mob assault on American justice.
We heard on Little Al that they were going to fix the jury. So what we did, at the very last minute, we went to Judge Julius Hoffman and we informed him of what was going on as far as these jurors were concerned. And so at the very last minute, just as they were going to trial, he switched the jury panel.
The switch paid off. Accardo was convicted. The Godfather appealed.
The only problem was then we heard them discussing on Little Al that they were going to approach a couple of members of the Seventh Circuit of the Court of Appeals. And by gosh, if the Court of Appeals in a 2-to-1 decision didn't overthrow the verdict.
Accardo was a free man, but the outfit did not take lightly these intrusions by the law into their secret world.
The mob came after me and my family in 1963. They would call my wife. They'd ask her who I was sleeping with that night. And then they would call her and say, Jeannie, we got him tonight, and I hope you kissed him when he left home today really good, because you're never going to see him again. We killed him tonight.
Romer decided it was time to establish some rules of his own. He approached Murray the Camel Humphreys, the outfit's elder statesman.
I said, we ought to form some kind of an agreement here. You ought to be fair game and we ought to be fair game, but not our kids and not our wives. He took it to the mob and then came back a week later and we sat down again and we called that the family pact. And they honored it. There was honor among those people, especially under Accardo.
Such honor enabled the brutal Accardo to earn a measure of respect even from the law.
I always had a grudging respect for Tony Accardo, and I was not unusual in that regard. All the people on both sides of the law had a great respect for Tony Accardo.
From 1960 to 1982, Accardo remained as the outfit's chairman of the board, consulted on all matters but not running the show directly. Law enforcement left the aging Godfather alone. Then the feds decided to take one more shot at Accardo. He and other mobsters were brought to trial in Miami on racketeering charges. Everyone was convicted, except the big tuna.
We caused him a lot of anguish, I think, but I know that we never got him. We never fulfilled our desire to put Tony Accardo away.
By 1984, Accardo was 78 years old. Time was running out for the feds. One last Senate Committee on Organized Crime called him in.
And of course, some people said if he talks, then he himself could be hit. But Tony Accardo was no patsy.
We have information which may be said to be general public information that you headed the Chicago Organized Crime Syndicate for many years. Isn't that true?
No, sir.
That is not true?
No, sir.
Have you ever been associated in any way with any illegal activity?
Yes, sir. Sir?
What were those illegal activities?
Huh? What were those activities? I gambled.
Have you ever killed anyone?
No, sir.
Have you ever directed anybody to commit murder?
No, sir.
What was your association with with Al Capone?
None association at all. Just friendly. Hello, and how are you?
It was quite a performance, believe me. Accardo had a charmed life also. Some good attorneys and a few breaks, and you have to count on that. But that's incredible. When you realize that he was an organized crime figure from the 20s until really, I guess, the day that he died in 1992, and was under the tremendous target by the federal government, is quite a story.
In January 1951, witnesses are paraded before a U.S. Senate Committee on Organized Crime. Among them, 41-year-old Godfather Carlos Marcello. Before a national TV audience, the mob czar of Louisiana sat majestically, refusing to reveal a thing not even his age or date of birth. Unamused by Marcello's arrogant treatment of American justice, Senator Estes Kefauver cited the Godfather with contempt. The senator called Marcello the evil genius of organized crime in Louisiana and questioned how it was that a criminal alien would be allowed to remain in this country. In doing so, Kefauver set the stage for a confrontation that would pit the little man of the South against the power of a president and his brother, the Attorney General. But before that historic confrontation, Marcello spent 30 years building his empire with impunity. The New Orleans mob, isolated from the crime families of New York, was used to playing by its own rules. That began to change by 1930, when New York's crime-busting mayor Fiorello LaGuardia kicked mobster Frank Costello and his illegal slot and gambling machines out of town.
Machines are owned and operated by the gangsters and racketeers. They derive a very lucrative income from them. Have been for years. Now I'm going to stop it.
Looking to relocate, Costello allegedly cut a deal with legendary Louisiana Senator Huey Long. Long would let Costello bring his slot machines into Louisiana in return for 10% of the take. Costello enlisted Marcello to strong-arm the bars and restaurants of New Orleans into using his gaming machines. Marcello was also running a lucrative marijuana ring. Busted in 1938, Marcello used his mob and political connections to get off with a brief 9-month sentence and a $400 fine.
He learned very early in life that politicians were greedy, and it could be paid off, and you could get away with anything.
A vital part of Marcello's mob education, keeping the law at arm's length for decades to come. In 1947, at age 38, Carlos took over as head of the New Orleans mob. Like every successful godfather, he ruled with brutality.
If someone crossed him, he would get severely clubbed over the head by Marcello's henchmen, and his body would be put into a bathtub of lye, and it would decompose in there, and then they would dump the decomposed liquid into the swamp, and the story got around that if you crossed Carlos Marcello, that would be your fate.
Marcello didn't worry about the law. In 1953, the feds issued an order to deport him, since he had never become a U.S. citizen. Just like Carlo Gambino, Marcello managed to ignore it. He set up his headquarters in his newly acquired motel, the Town and Country. A sign above his office door read, "3 can keep a secret if 2 are dead." With the money Carlos earned from his gambling and drug rings, he financed a vast and complex array of operations, many of them legal. But it was primarily power, political power, which Marcello sought. In his quest to gain influence, the 5'2" godfather stood tall, with his literal deep pockets.
He had a foot-long trouser pocket and one pair of trousers, in which he could carry as much as $20,000, $30,000 in bills.
I could see this hand go, and it looked like it was going down to his knee, and he pulls out this big roll of bills, and he peels off 5 100s.
And he would just go around reaching into that deep pocket and just pay off everybody, policemen, judges, in cold cash. Marcello corrupted practically every public official in the state.
But in 1959, his fortunes began to turn. In March, Congress once again called him to testify. Robert F. Kennedy, chief counsel to the McClellan Committee, grilled Marcello to no apparent satisfaction.
These men who in the last analysis control the vice and the corruption within this country, and who have so far been immune to prosecution almost since the days of Al Capone.
He drove Bobby Kennedy out of his mind by saying, "I can't answer that question, Senator."
In his unique Cajun drawl and with a scowl on his face, Marcello had refused to answer any of the questions put to him.
Then one of the senators on the committee said, How in the name of God have you been allowed to remain in this country 8 years after you were officially deported? And Marcello's response was, "I really wouldn't know, sir. I don't know anything about that."
The little man had taken the fifth at least 66 times.
At the end of the hearings, he threw Bobby Kennedy a dirty look, and he strutted out of the hearing room as if he was the king of the world. So Bobby Kennedy then said to his associates, someday I'm going to get rid of that guy. He's going to go.
January 1961, John Fitzgerald Kennedy takes the oath of office.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
For the mob, Kennedy's rise to power hardly seemed something to fear. In fact, privately, some of them took credit for it, including Chicago boss Sam Giancana.
In Chicago, Giancana counted all those gravestones twice, and it was by his efforts that swung the election to Kennedy. And he did it as a favor to Kennedy's father, Joe.
The president's father had plenty of underworld connections from his days as a bootlegger during Prohibition. Allegations that the mob tampered with election returns have persisted for decades. No criminal charges were ever filed. But even if the mob thought they were buying friendship in the White House, they were mistaken. The president's brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, was spoiling for the biggest war on the mob since Tom Dewey went after Lucky Luciano. One of the first to feel the heat, none other than Carlos Marcello. 2 years earlier, the Louisiana Godfather had defied RFK at the McClellan hearings. Now Kennedy returned the favor, enforcing a deportation order against Marcello from 1953. Robert Blakey worked for Kennedy in the Justice Department.
And when Kennedy came in, he turned to the head of the INS and said, this guy's got to go. Let's deport him.
The feds plotted to snatch Marcello without notice and dump him in the jungles of Guatemala.
He had Marcello, with no warning to his family or to his lawyer or to anybody, picked up at the immigration service where he was making a call and whisked away to the airport where there was already a federal plane on the tarmac with its engines going.
Without legal process, without an opportunity to get a toothbrush, he suddenly finds himself in a jungle, actually in physical danger.
Eventually, Marcello got in touch with his underworld friends. He illegally re-entered the United States and was charged once again. The legal wrangling would last for years, as would the deep wound to Marcello's pride. But Bobby Kennedy had loftier goals than simply humiliating one godfather. He was out to destroy organized crime entirely.
We made some recommendations for legislation which we feel would make a major impact on the operations of the big-time gamblers and racketeers throughout the country.
As part of his crusade, Kennedy revamped the Justice Department, creating strike forces throughout the country, which focused solely on organized crime. The mob knew they were in Kennedy's crosshairs.
They were outraged at early stages that they were being investigated, and they commented that this was not right, this was not fair, there was a change.
Marcello's hatred was especially strong. According to Marcello defense attorney Frank Regano,
he used a lot of obscenities in describing the Kennedys, in particular Bobby Kennedy, and how Bobby Kennedy had him kidnapped and forcibly flown to Guatemala, and he detested Bobby Kennedy for doing that to him and how he would get even with him someday.
And he seemed to mean it, hinting to Las Vegas mob insider Ed Becker during a casual meeting that he himself would take care of the problem.
I said, geez, you kill Bobby Kennedy, you'll have the whole United States government on you, you know. Who says they're going to kill him? He says, but what you do, you cut off at the head, the tail dies.
The idea was that if he killed Bobby Kennedy, the president would probably call out the National Guard. But Marcello reasoned that if he killed President Kennedy, it would completely neutralize his brother.
In 1979, a House committee concluded that there probably was a conspiracy to assassinate President Kennedy. They hinted that the mob was behind it. Robert Blakey was chief counsel.
People have posited that the mob killed Kennedy, And apart from whether that's true or not, I can tell you this: they were the chief beneficiaries of the death.
Lyndon Johnson gave him the cold shoulder, and Bobby Kennedy was bereft of all power.
Once Robert Kennedy left the department, and he left shortly after the president's death, the program fell apart.
In other words, Marcello won.
Bobby Kennedy was among those who speculated the Godfather was behind his brother's assassination.
One evening after John Kennedy was assassinated, that Bobby Kennedy was having a few drinks with one of his closest associates, an aide, and he told this aide that he thought the fellow in New Orleans was behind the assassination of his brother. And he was very emphatic about that.
For American justice, the practical impact of JFK's assassination and RFK's departure the following year from the Justice Department was a step backward in the war with the Godfathers. The mob's fears were briefly rekindled when Bobby Kennedy ran for president in 1968.
My thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there.
Fears that were quickly silenced by another assassin's bullet. But Kennedy's legacy as a crime fighter endured. As Attorney General, he had pushed for new laws to attack the mob as an organization.
What had to happen is we had to think about this as patterns of crime. We had to think about this as criminal organizations.
Blakey followed Kennedy's lead and found inspiration in an earlier battle between Godfathers and the law.
I went back and looked at how the Luciano prosecution was made. The number of ideas that come out of Dewey's early prosecutions are just remarkable.
The result, by 1970, American justice had not only passed wiretapping laws, but also the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, better known as RICO, a law allowing prosecutors to attack mobsters for a series of crimes rather than individual ones. RICO would have a devastating impact on organized crime and on Carlos Marcello, but for the time being, he was still king of Louisiana, denying his role as a racketeer.
The government's counsels asked you if you were involved in rackets still. What was your answer to that?
Absolutely not.
How long ago did you get out of so-called rackets or gambling?
Well, in 1951.
Since that time, what's been your business?
Land investment and motels.
What's your opinion of all the talk about still your involvements in the rackets and you're being labeled a mafia boss of a little man of rackets in Louisiana?
Just a lot of lies and bad statements from Aaron Cohn, people like that.
In 1977, the feds began using their new legal weapons for a final assault on Marcello. Agent Eads Hogue was part of the FBI strike force in New Orleans.
I had gotten a good sense of Mr. Marcello and how he played his game. There was this aura of this man as being absolutely invincible. He was an untouchable.
Two undercover agents arranged a meeting with Marcello. They posed as insurance salesmen, soliciting the Godfather's help in bribing public officials to win government employee insurance contracts. It was a racket the little man knew well. The room was bugged, and Marcello took the bait.
The tapes revealed his absolute desire and interest in assisting these undercover agents in their attempts to get public employee insurance contracts through bribery.
Marcello's lawyers say the Godfather didn't see this as bribery.
That's where it is with Carlos. I think that he was engaged in unlawful activities, such as bribing public officials and all, but he didn't consider it a crime in his own mind. It just was a way of doing business. He had all the politicians and judges and prosecutors in his hip pocket, so he didn't think he would ever be charged with a criminal offense.
But this time, Marcello was wrong. On June 17, 1980, the Godfather was indicted. Defense attorney Buddy Lemon said the feds had unfairly entrapped the Godfather.
The come on was not, let's go and rob a bank. It wasn't, let's go and smuggle drugs. It was, we are legitimate people from a legitimate insurance company who have a good product that will save the people of Louisiana some money, and we want an opportunity to meet important citizens and politicians, and we're willing to make campaign contributions to do that.
But the government prevailed. Carlos Marcello was found guilty of racketeering and sentenced to 7 years in federal prison, a case that sent a message to the mob that with the help of powerful new laws and agents trained to use them, American justice could bring down one of the nation's most formidable godfathers.
It had to be delivered here in this state because there was a legend widely accepted that one man, Mr. Marcello, was above the law.
Putting Marcello away took some of the best evidence the feds ever had against a godfather. Organized crime has always managed to give the law a run for its money, and no place more so than in Las Vegas. In the 1930s, Lucky Luciano organized the New York mob like a Fortune 500 company. Clear objectives: make money, exercise power, minimize bloodshed. As godfathers around the country took those lessons to heart, one city came to epitomize the mob's ability to succeed in business: Las Vegas. The underworld meets the upper world. Suckers fly in from everywhere, lose money, get drunk, and happily line the pockets of every godfather in America. Everyone knew the mob was skimming profits from the casinos, which they controlled but never technically owned. Ed Becker handled public relations for the Riviera when it was under the control of the Chicago outfit.
They, skimmed and laundered. They would have their own man in on the count. In those days, they didn't have officials in on the count. Well, the count was always off.
Mob figures throughout the United States had points in the skim, and the money was taken by couriers from Las Vegas to the various places in New Jersey and Chicago.
The rise of Vegas is the ultimate tale of mob entrepreneurship. In the 1940s, the dashing New York mobster Bugsy Siegel dreamed up the idea of transforming the sleepy desert town into a glittering resort. He borrowed millions in a deal with his old mobster pals back east, Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano. Bugsy built his dream hotel and casino, the Flamingo, named after his girlfriend, Virginia Hill. Her nickname was Flamingo on account of her long legs. Only problem was, Bugsy, the natural-born killer, made a crummy businessman.
While he was building the Flamingo, they were double billing him, the construction people. He'd pay for 500 palm trees shipped up from California. They'd steal them and then deliver 500 more the next week, and the same palm trees were going back and forth.
The casino lost money. Bugsy was also a bit unstable.
Because somebody said hello to Virginia Hill, he's going to shoot him. Well, Lansky is too bright for that, and the mob was too bright to have a loose cannon on the strip in Las Vegas. And he wasn't going to make them any money, they could see that.
So on the night of June 20th, 1947, Bugsy was sitting in the living room of his girlfriend's palatial home in Beverly Hills when hitmen, presumably sent by Lansky and Luciano, shot and killed him. One of his eyes blown clear out of his head and across the room. Business as usual for the mob, and a turning point for Vegas. That very night, a gambling boss named Gus Greenbaum, also acting on mob orders, walked right into the Flamingo and simply took over. The mob was determined to make good on its investment, and they did. In 1958, the mob suggested that Greenbaum retire. He refused. A bad move.
They took my boss and cut his throat and cut his wife's throat down in Phoenix because he wouldn't retire. And I realized this isn't a game, that these people are very serious. And I didn't want to be in that game.
In the 1960s and 70s, tighter gaming regulations and a crackdown by the IRS made it more difficult for the mob to take its regular skim from the casinos. So the mob did what all good businessmen do in such circumstances. They sold out. One of those who bought in was billionaire Howard Hughes.
It became corporate after Howard Hughes took over. If he did anything, he changed it into a corporate town, and that's how it is today.
Large corporations have bought these casinos, and they have bureaucratized them. When the market demands family entertainment run by large corporations, there's no place for the mob in the same way.
Las Vegas is not the only place where the old Mafia has lost control. Because over the decades since Lucky Luciano organized the mob, the law has proven itself a worthy adversary. From Thomas Dewey putting Luciano away for running a prostitution racket, to Bobby Kennedy declaring war against Carlos Marcello, American justice has learned to wage war on the Godfathers.
We now have the tools. We now know how to do it. I think it's fair to say that